Hi everybody, it's Matt here, local friendly neighbourhood vestibular migraine sufferer. I hope you are well and doing as well as can be expected, and I hope wherever you are, some of the lockdown measures are going to be lifting soon, because in my opinion there's nothing worse for vestibular migraine than being in lockdown, so having to stay inside, not being able to get out and about and start getting yourself used to the symptoms or getting rid of the symptoms by re-engaging with normal life. So I hope that position and lockdown eases and lifts for you soon wherever you are. So I'm doing a video today about diagnosis. So quite a lot of people have asked me about diagnosis when they are asking questions on these videos or in conversations with other sufferers. And this isn't diagnosis murder with Barry Van Dyke, it's diagnosis migraine, this video. So there you go. So the diagnosis of vestibular migraine, from my own experience and then from hearing from others, is quite a painstaking process. And when you're poorly, there's nothing worse than not actually knowing what is wrong, because when you don't know what is wrong, and with some of the actual symptoms we experience with vestibular migraine or even vestibular disorders, it's scary because they are similar symptoms to really horrible things like brain tumours or multiple sclerosis. So when you add that uncertainty into the vestibular mix, so when you've already got these horrible symptoms, you've got the worry of what could be wrong with you, but then you also have the thing you can't help, which is fired up anxiety anyway, because your vestibular system is disrupted, as I've explained in the video. If the vestibular system is disrupted, then your mood side of your brain and system is also disrupted, so you can't have really one without the other. All that put together is just a really, really awful blender of suffering. So I think getting a diagnosis is quite key, and it's also, for me, it's the first major step on the road to recovery. So in cricket terms, if you're chasing the opposition's target of 400 runs, so that your first 50, your first half century at the crease with the bat is kind of your first major step to chasing down that total. So diagnosis is really important. So people do struggle to get a diagnosis, and that's quite common. So, but I think there's a couple of reasons for this, and the first one, I think, is because it's only very recently that vestibular migraine has become classed as a condition in its own right, as its own unique form of migraine. So it's existed since time began, since we probably were coming out of the caves as cavemen, but nobody really defined what it was. We know, for example, it existed in Victorian times and before, because it was recorded and known as floating women's syndrome, and the poor lasses who suffered with it were either burnt at the stake for being a witch or thrown in jail. That's not to say that there aren't the occasional witches out there. I've met a few, might have even dated a few, but anyway, that's another matter. So we know it has existed, but it's finally now getting its own paradigm of science. So that is one of the reasons why I think people struggle to get a diagnosis, because although it is now coming into its own as a condition, there's still a lack of awareness of it. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing these videos, is to raise awareness of this really crappy condition. So, and I'm not here to diss GPs, because Dr. McCall, my GP, is particularly great, but I think GPs are obviously trained to diagnose the most likely thing first, based on the evidence, based on your symptoms. So I think still that, because vestibular migraine is a new form of condition, it's still not as well known as it should be. So when you go to GP with these symptoms, you're likely for them to go down the road of something like labyrinthitis, or even the benign positional vertigo, whatever it's called. They usually go for those two options as kind of like a first thing that could be wrong with you. And as I said, they're trained to do that, so that's why it happens. Even though I do think vestibular migraine is rather common, but I think probably still those two of the symptoms edge it or are more common, particularly in the winter time when there's bugs going around. So that's usually why they go down that route. So that obviously means it's difficult to sometimes get a diagnosis. And I think the other reason why is vestibular migraine is one of those hidden illnesses, really, isn't it? So with many conditions and illnesses, there's usually tests you can do or scans that can be done that will show up something that then allows the doctor to diagnose what you've got. So for example, if you break your leg, they can look at an x-ray and see whether the leg's broken or fractured. If, for example, you are suffering from diabetes, they can do a blood test, and that will tell them if, for example, and hopefully no one listening to this has, but if you've got MS, they can see marks on your brain, for example, that show you've got the MS condition. So, but with vestibular migraine, there's not really anything they can see. So, if you've had, say you've had a vestibular illness like the virus that has damaged your vestibular nerve, that can show up on certain scans or through certain tests. So, you have a hearing test, I think, for that. So that if your hearing's diminished, that's one way they can diagnose damage. And I think they may be able to pick something up on the MRI scan if you have one. With vestibular migraine, none of that will show. You'll pass the hearing test. You won't show anything on your MRI scans. So I think that's another reason why specialists and doctors are reluctant to conclude that it's vestibular migraine, because I guess they don't really like diagnosing things that are almost like non-tangible, that are almost like a ghost condition. So those are the two big reasons why I think it really happens. So as I said, it's really, really important for you to eventually get a diagnosis, because it's awful not to have one, and it's also the first stage. Remember, batting in cricket, the first stage of getting towards getting better. So in terms of tips on how to get a diagnosis is, I mean, I'm no expert, and I think it's a combination of luck as well. I think there's an element of luck if you see the right specialist who particularly is interested in vestibular migraine or whatever, or they're just a decent doctor or physician, then that will help. But so that's something I can't advise on really, but I will mention something on that at the end of the video. But one of the things I did was that I actually, and this can be a double-edged sword, but I did start Googling and doing some research on what I was experiencing, and eventually that actually brought me towards like labyrinthitis, or the vestibular form, the virus side of the vestibular labyrinthitis. It's the one basically where there isn't any dizziness. So, and I remember before that I kept getting fobbed up of it either being just a virus, or more annoyingly, just it's anxiety and nerves. It sounds like no. Anyway, I've done other videos on that, so I've ranted in those. But anyway, so doing this research meant that I actually was like, oh, there is something here actually. I'm starting to see myself in a lot of what's being said here, and then and then shared that with mum and dad, and then they were often saying it's probably anxiety, but once they'd seen that, they were starting to go, actually maybe there is something physical going on here. So that helped me. So then when I went to start to see, for example, my GP, or then when I went to see my ENT, which was my specialist in the UK, I was able to say, I've got these symptoms and they seem similar to labyrinthitis or similar to vestibular neuritis, the virus, that kind of thing. And I think that really helped me when I went in there, and then that can then certainly start putting them, or focusing their mind and your mind down the kind of like the right roads instead of going down blind alleys, if that makes sense. And I think another crucial thing I did is, and I've mentioned this before, but not only did I see an ENT, but I actually paid to go and see a vestibular physio. So fortunately where I live, there is one you can pay and go and see, but I'm sure there is in other places in the country and indeed around the world. So do have a look into this, Google it and find out. But so I went to see the vestibular physio, and vestibular physios, as you know, are experts on the vestibular system, and they're really trained to diagnose problems with the vestibular system. So they can actually do tests that certainly standard GPs can't do. I'm sure some specialists can, but certainly standard GPs can't, that are quite specific to probe and test the vestibular system to see if it's upset or got some issue with it. So when I went to see my vestibular physio, she did two tests I can remember. The first one was that I had to stand with my eyes shut and my hands out in front of me, and then I had to march on the spot. And what I didn't know, because I had my eyes shut, but I actually moved across the room and almost hit the door, and she had to stop me before I did. But I didn't know I was moving, so that was one thing that indicated that I had an issue with my vestibular system. The second test was one where I had to fixate on the brim of her nose, so it was actually the rim of her glasses actually. And then she rotated my head from side to side while I remained focused on her glasses, and then she would bring my head to a dead stop like that. And so she could see that when that was happening, when my right eye sort of moved back to the centre. So actually when my head moved back to the centre, my right eye lagged a little bit. So I suppose it's a bit like those Terminator eyes where his eyes kind of move first, then his head moves, but kind of in the wrong way. So the eye wasn't quite locking on. So she could tell from those two tests that something was wrong with my vestibular system. It does have an official name, that, and I just can't remember what it is, but you can Google it or you can look it on YouTube. I just can't remember it. I don't remember what I did yesterday, let alone what tests were called from a year ago. So that was really useful and that showed that my vestibular system was upset in some way. So that started to really narrow things down. And then I was able to then take that information from the physio to the specialist when I went to see the specialist, because I saw the physio first, then eventually saw the specialist. So that was then put in. So as we can see from what's happening around the world at the moment, but the more information you have on medical conditions and that kind of thing, the better it is to make a diagnosis and the better it is to treat. So I went in armed with that, plus obviously some of the research I'd done. So those two things came together, and then so essentially my physio ultimately still thought I must have had some kind of vestibular kind of virus, or a virus that affected the vestibular system. But the ENT edged out towards vestibular migraine, the diagnosis of that, because of some information I gave her. So my another tip is to don't hold back. Even if you think something's trivial or irrelevant, say it in the thing. So basically, I obviously mentioned the photophobia I'd been experiencing, because that was one of my worst symptoms, because it's just horrible. You can't really function anywhere outside of the black hole. But I mentioned that, but then I also mentioned that I'd had an episode of this thing years ago, and I got better fairly quickly, but at the time they prescribed me amitriptyline. So I mentioned those two things, and kind of like the light bulb you could see behind her eyes was like going, and she was like, yeah, I think this is what we call vestibular migraine. She said, because of the photophobia you've got there, and the the treatment I had before with the amitriptyline, and also there is family history of migraine in my family as well. So if there's that, definitely tell them that as well. So she was saying, with kind of like conventional upset to the vestibular system, like the virus, caused by the virus, you wouldn't normally get the photophobia. She said that's because with conventional migraine, of course, people do get photophobia. So, it was that crucial fact, that symptom I explained to took me down that road. So, as I said, even if it seems trivial, say it to her. And also, before you go and see your specialist, make a note of all your symptoms so you don't forget to tell her anything, or her or him, sorry. Because if you do forget and then you come out and it's a crucial piece of information, you'll be kicking yourself. And then also, it might be that crucial bit of the jigsaw that solves the puzzle. It's just like in a murder case or whatever. So it's actually almost diagnosed as murder, isn't it, this video? But anyway, so that's definitely something you should do. So also the final kind of tip as well is, I think people tend to think of medical appointments as going in and it's like you being kind of almost not lectured at, but it's like them on telling you what's what and what will happen. Whereas quite a lot of doctors, more modern ones as well, I have to say, new ones, they're quite good at like it being more of a collaboration, like you're both working on a diagnosis and treatment plan, if you like, and to get you better. My GP, Dr. McCall, is excellent at that. It's one of his many strong points. So don't forget that you can shape that appointment too, and you can say, well, I kind of think it could be, can I try that med to see whether it works, because it could be vestibular migraine, And the other thing I would do as well is, if you are, particularly if you're in the UK, I can't say for some of the other countries, unfortunately, because I'm not, use medical services in those countries other than the UK. But in the UK, what you can do, of course, you can go private, and whatever your views are on that, I'm not here to debate that. But if you go private, you can basically get a letter from your GP, and then you can actually go to any neurologist or ENT around the country effectively. So that, I think, is quite a good move, because then you can Google, or you can do some research on the Facebook page, or talk to fellow sufferers, message me, for example, and actually find out who the better neurologists are, or who the better ones or ENTs for vestibular migraine, if that's what you think you've got. And then you can actually go and see them, and you don't have to just go to the one at your local hospital. So that's definitely something that's something I did actually in my my twin brother actually researched and found a consultant called Mrs. Douglas, who I saw, who's in the Sheffield area, and she had a really good resume and particularly focused on, you know, vestibular issues and kind of all the problems I had. So that would be another final tip, probably the final tip, given I've gone on a bit of a long time. I looked at my watch, but there's no watch on. I've gone on a bit, so it's probably the final tip of the video. So those things, I think, are all key to helping you get a diagnosis, but pursue it, stick with it, be like a dog with a bone, because getting a diagnosis is so crucial. It helps you start settling down in terms of thinking you've got something that's going to kill you, blow your head off or whatever. And it also then takes you on that step towards recovery. You start taking those small steps along that long road to recovery. It's absolutely crucial. So be dogged. Don't be aggressive. I was about to say be aggressive. There's no need to be aggressive, but be dogged. Be like Roy Keane in midfield for Man United. Don't give up. Just get them tackles in until you get that diagnosis. And as I say, it might not be a diagnosis for vestibular migraine. It may be something else you have, but, you know, you'll get a diagnosis for whatever. Ultimately, you want the diagnosis for what is wrong with you, don't you? The correct one. So that's what you're striving for. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I thought I rambled a little bit there, but as you know, I don't do these videos with any script at all. I just talk off the top of my head. But yeah, diagnosis is absolutely crucial. So I'll leave it there. As I say at the end of the videos, as you were, you'll be again. So I'm saying it now, and I'm saying it both for vestibular migraine. I'm saying it for anybody out there who's worrying about COVID-19. As we were, we'll be again. So I'll take care, and I'll see you soon. Matt.